The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
Where strange lights speed beyond reason across a clear night sky.
The house at the end of the road where disembodied voices whisper and strange noises make the living shiver.
Lurking shadows hiding on the edge of the woods just outside your back door.
Odd, true events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole. I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. If you're new to our podcast, I'm Wes, and that's my wife and co-host, Beth.
Hello, everyone. So tonight's episode is all about the paranormal, which I've always been fascinated by. Well, actually, that's not true. As a kid, I was terrified by the idea of ghosts, but as I've gotten older, I have become more genuinely fascinated by it, and I'm much more comfortable with the idea of ghosts.
Like some of you, we've had some pretty interesting, unexplainable things that has happened to us throughout life that just leaves us, like many people, searching for some kind of explanation.
Yes, we have. And as much as I'd like to have all the answers, I also kind of want it to remain a mystery. So it's kind of a conundrum.
Right, and it's fun researching and hearing about other people's experiences, from modern day and stories from the past.
So, where did your mind wander for your story tonight?
Well, I'm combining my love of old bars with the paranormal. So sit back, get comfy, and perhaps have some adult spirits, and let's get into it. There are certain drinking establishments that are just so freaking cool. The architecture and history just beckon you to come in. Maybe you have one where you live, a place that you go and meet up with friends to unwind after a long day of work, or perhaps to celebrate special occasions. We all have our own reasons. Perhaps you go there because of the ambiance, or you're single and you like to escape to a place where interesting people gather with all kinds of conversations and stories. Maybe it's because of the friends that you've made there over the years. It just feels like it's your place, a relaxing, familiar place. It kind of brings you back to those days of watching Cheers on TV. The place where everybody knows your name.
And now that song's going to be stuck in my head for the rest of the night. Thank you.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a good song. But what if the bar you frequent seems to be the place for spirits other than the alcoholic kind? The bar I'm talking about tonight just might be that place. Shaker's Cigar Bar in Milwaukee, Wisconsin is one of those places that I would definitely frequent if I lived there. Located in Milwaukee's historic 3rd Ward, Shaker's has been a staple of Milwaukee for decades. Standing outside of the entrance, the narrow 3-story building has an almost Tudor-style look to it. At night, the exterior is lit up by purple lighting that engulfs it. The tavern is flanked by 2 equal-sized large storefront windows on the bottom floor. On the right is a door that leads upstairs and seems to perfectly balance out the symmetry of the 2 top floors that have perfectly paired bays extending out over the entrance of the establishment. As you enter, there are 2 marble lions that have been painted turquoise and gold, and they're on each side of the steps leading up to 2 large antique doors that welcome you in. The interior was painstakingly designed to look exactly like a drinking establishment of the 20s and 30s. It has a tin ceiling that was taken from the Plantinkin Mansion, a stone beauty that was demolished in 1980. This ornate Victorian-style bar's interior includes 2 highly elaborate salvaged bars, and stained glass is abundant inside and out. A 1905 glass-topped cigar humidor, which was used in the speakeasy days, sits in the cigar bar. The fixtures and fittings are works of art that garnished the mansions of the Gilded Age. Many of the walls are dark, rich wood that's ornately carved, and it has beautiful maple wood floors that support marble-top tables and oak chairs. Ornate wallpaper, Victorian furniture, and antiques are to be found throughout the interior, and amber lighting glows off the dark red walls. You can imagine yourself sitting back in a soft, comfy leather cigar chair after a nice dinner, sipping bourbon and smoking your favorite cigar, conversing with friends. One cannot truly describe it into words, so I highly recommend checking out pictures of it online.
It sounds like the perfect place for you. Like it sounds like a place that you would just absolutely love.
It is. It just looks like a place where we would feel right at home. The owners have embraced the idea that the bar is haunted and offer beers with names like Ghost Ale, Shadow People, unless you want to try absinthe, which is also available, or one of their cognacs, which date back to 1879. The first floor is for enjoying a cigar and a drink, and the third floor offers overnight guests a place to sleep, especially if they are willing to share their space with a ghost or two. So, who haunts Shaker's Cigar Bar? Well, we should take a look at the building's history to try to narrow it down a bit. Before anything was built there, 3 orchards covered the area, but then part of it became one of the 3 original cemeteries in southeastern Wisconsin. At that time, as cemeteries became full and Milwaukee was expanding, many of the bodies were relocated to Forest Home Cemetery. However, that move was often contingent on whether or not your family cared enough to have you moved or if they had enough money to pay for the reinterment. Sadly, many families did not, and so their ancestors remained in their original burials. The first building on the property, a cooperage for the Schlitz Brewing Company, was built right on top of the old cemetery in 1894, so probably not off to a good start.
No, not really, because we've heard before you don't build on top of cemeteries.
This is true. In 1922, the building was purchased by the ABC Soda Company as a bottling store, which may not sound particularly exciting. But the ABC Soda Company was really just a front. The building was actually now owned by Al Capone and his brother Frank. They set up a speakeasy on the first floor, complete with bootlegging, and a brothel on the upper 2 floors. The brothel was in operation until 1945. So, you've got gambling, illegal booze, one of the most famous mobsters of all time, and brothel activity, all in the same building. So, you can imagine the staff and patrons have experienced some ghostly activity. Now, the current owner of the bar, Bob Weiss, says that when it comes to hauntings, he's seen or heard it all at Shaker's. Full-bodied apparitions, shadow people, disembodied voices, lights and faucets turning off and on, and doors shutting and locking. Blonde and red-headed female patrons tend to have their hair tugged by unseen hands. The basement is like all creepy basements: stone walls, cobwebs, dark corners. It seems like a sort of catch-all for unseasonal furniture and things like that today, but back in the day, it was used by the Capone brothers as a private place to do business. Card games were played down there, as well as other activities. There were rumors that at least one person had died down there after a card game got ugly. Even knowing the history, you'd think that delivery men and contractors would be used to going down into the creepy basement. But apparently, quite a few have left hand tools and empty containers down there, rather than venture back into the area after making a delivery. They may have encountered the apparition of the man in overalls, who is said to be rather territorial about this space. One staff member has talked about going down into the basement for napkins, and while she was down there, the door to a simple storage room began to violently shake against its casing, as if someone wanted to be let out. She ran back upstairs, and when the staff went back down later, the lock on the door was bent outwards, as if someone with incredible strength was struggling to break it from the inside.
That's creepy.
Could it have been the man in the overalls? No one is sure who he is, but the current owner had heard enough stories to call in a crew, to do some ground-penetrating radar. They discovered several anomalies beneath the concrete floor, but one blip on the radar turned out to be worth exploring. When the owner began to dig, he found 2 sets of human remains, sort of huddled up next to each other. The remains were old and didn't match any known missing person cases, so they were left there. But maybe one of them is the spirit of the man in overalls who chases out employees and workers. The 2 skeletons in the basement aren't the only remains that were found at Shaker's. As I mentioned earlier, the top floor is now a penthouse that people can rent for a night. Remember, it used to be a brothel. Well, during renovations, workers came across charred bones in a wall. Some were animals, some were not. It was determined that the human remains belonged to a female in her late teens to early 20s, and that they were at least 70 years old. After researching historical archives, the staff believed that the remains are of Molly Brennan, a worker in the former brothel. How exactly Molly came to be killed, dismembered, burned, and hidden in the wall, isn't known for certain, but the local lore is that one night, Molly received a visit from an ex named Patrick. The brothel has 2 floors. The B girls worked on the 2nd floor, and the A girls, like Molly, were on the 3rd. Patrick wanted Molly to leave Shaker's and run off with him. She wanted to, but the fear of the Capone brothers made her stay. One night, when Patrick came back again to beg her to leave with him, he found her providing services for his very own father.
Oh, no.
That's right.
Oh.
In a rage, Patrick killed her. Some say he also killed Sam, the bouncer who was usually at the top of the stairs, and himself after hiding her charred remains in the wall.
She was killed and dismembered and burned. That's a lot of rage.
That is. Well, she was with his dad.
If that's true.
If it's true. But that would probably be enough to set you off.
I guess. She was a working woman. She had to make her money somehow.
Right. Well, I don't know. Whether all or part of this lore is untrue, what is true are the weird experiences people claim to have in the $365 a night penthouse.
That's a lot.
In some cases, people who have rented the penthouse go up there after last call at around 10:30, and by midnight are turning in their key, saying they just can't stay there any longer. Molly allegedly likes to turn lights on and off, mess with the TV, and move items around the room. Her apparition has appeared in photographs also. She's even been known to touch people while they're sleeping, and some guests have reported a disembodied female voice when no one else is in the suite with them.
Maybe she wants to set the record straight and tell her story.
Well, that could be. There's a 3rd spirit at Shaker's, whom everyone calls Elizabeth. The consensus seems to be that Elizabeth passed away at age 8 in 1850 when she fell from one of the trees in the apple orchard and broke her neck. She has haunted the building ever since. Apparently, she likes to hang around the women's restroom, which sounds funny, but I can imagine it's a little bit creepy. Put it this way, you go into the bathroom, shut the stall door. You're in the middle of doing your thing when suddenly you hear a little girl's voice, which is odd in a cigar bar. Then you hear the sink faucet turn on and off. Then someone knocks on the door of the stall you're in.
I probably would just think it's another patron, and I'd be like, just a minute. But I would also be wondering why there's a little girl in a bar.
Well, apparently, quite a few women have been able to see someone standing on the other side of the door, or at least the feet of someone. And they swear it has to be a young girl, based on the size of her legs, and she's wearing 19th century shoes.
Okay, so then I'd probably think there's some sort of reenactment going on.
Except when the women open the stall door, there's no one in there but them.
Oh, well, that's different then. Because you would think if somebody had come in and then left, you would have heard the sound of the bar, like amplified when the door opened, the outer door, and then You would have heard them coming and going. So yeah, that's pretty creepy. But I'm wondering if she hangs around the bathroom because it's the one place where maybe she could get a woman's attention. I mean, it's quieter in there. You're generally alone. So maybe she chose that spot because she knows someone will notice her there.
Well, that could be. I could kind of see that. Well, who knows? So besides looking like a really cool bar that offers cigars, top shelf liquor, and from what I can tell from the reviews, pretty good food, Shaker Cigar Bar has built quite a reputation as a haunted bar, which they don't shy away from. Instead, they embrace it, giving all kinds of ghost historical tours and allowing paranormal investigators to come in. So it sounds like a cool place. One day, I'd like to check out.
We will add it to our bucket list.
Boy, that bucket list is getting pretty long.
We're going to need more than one bucket. We need a multiple bucket list. Hey, did you know? In medieval Scotland, there was a pretty ingenious way the MacDonald clan settled their disputes. They simply sent the arguing individuals to the Island of Discussion, a small island in Loch Leven, armed with nothing but whiskey, cheese, and oatcakes. They stayed there until their dispute was settled. Then they were rowed to another island, aptly called the Isle of Covenant, to put onto paper what they had come to agree on. In 1,500 years of practice, there was only one known homicide. Who'd have thunk it?
That's pretty interesting. I think perhaps that's what we need to do with some of today's politicians.
And just arm them with whiskey and cheese and oatcakes.
That's right. So, Beth, where did your mind wander this week?
Well, we've heard of cases where modern-day people have moved into a new home or have visited a place they've never been before, and they've had inexplicable, overwhelming visions of how someone died. The visions might go on for weeks or months to the point that that person feels compelled to do something about it. In some cases, these people have gone to the police because they feel so strongly that they are actually seeing what might have happened to someone. In most instances, the case they're envisioning is considered a cold one, and yet police officers are able to find evidence that proves that these random people are right. The story I'm going to tell is about one of the first documented cases of this happening, except it wasn't a random person and the case wasn't a cold one. It's actually the only case in U.S. history where the court documents actually say that the evidence was supplied by a spirit. I'm talking about the Greenbrier ghost.
Oh, I remember the first time I heard about this. It's pretty freaky.
A grieving mother, Mary Jane Heaster, was praying at her bedside, asking for her daughter's spirit to speak to her, when a ball of light filled the room, turning the air chilly. The next night, while Mary Jane prayed, a ball of light appeared and filled her bedroom again, only this time it seemed to morph into the solid shape of her daughter, Elva Heaster Shue. Elva urgently told her mother that she was cold and asked to climb into bed with her. She said she had something to tell her, that she had been murdered, that her husband had become angry over her making dinner without any meat, and in a fit of aggression had broken her neck. As if to prove it, Elva turned her head 360 degrees. Then Elva walked away from her mother's bedside, turning back to stare at her as she disappeared. Elva appeared to her mother in just this way for 4 nights in a row.
That had to be quite frightening.
Now, Elva was most certainly dead. She had been buried just 1 month before, under very strange circumstances. In fact, her entire death was very strange. And now Mary Jane knew for certain what had happened. Her son-in-law had killed her. Elva's ghost had told her so. 23-year-old Elva Heaster married 37-year-old blacksmith Edward Shue in 1896 in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, just a few short weeks after meeting him. They lived in a log cabin 14 miles away from Mary Jane, and by all accounts, both were happy and well-liked by everyone. On January 23, 1897, Edward Shue was busy at the blacksmith shop, but wanted to check in on his new bride. They had only been married for 3 months. He asked 11-year-old Andy Clark, a neighbor's son, to run over to his house and ask Elva if she needed anything from town. But Andy was busy doing other chores, and Edward became increasingly frustrated, asking Andy several more times over the course of the afternoon to go check on his wife. According to later testimony, when Andy reached the front steps, he saw a trail of blood. Although he was scared, he knocked on the front door. When Mrs. Shue failed to come to the door, he opened it, because it was unlocked, and entered the kitchen. He saw a trail of blood lead from the kitchen to the closed dining room door. He knocked on that door too, and then opened it, stumbling on Mrs. Shue's body.
Now that's pretty sad because he knew that he was sending an 11-year-old boy over to find his dead wife's body.
Yes. At first, Andy thought Elva was asleep on the floor, right at the bottom of the staircase. Her legs were straight, her ankles pressed together, and one arm was across her chest, while the other was straight at her side. Her face was also tilted to the side. He approached her, calling her name, until he was close enough to see that her eyes were wide open. The boy fled from the house and ran home, telling his mother what he had found. His mother went directly to the town doctor, George W. Knapp. But by the time Dr. Knapp arrived at the Shue residence, Edward was already home. He had carried his wife upstairs, bathed her, and dressed her in a high-necked gown, and placed her on their bed. He had also placed a veil over her face. Edward was inconsolable, though, sitting on the bed with his wife's head in his lap, lovingly cradling her. When Dr. Knapp attempted to examine Elva's neck, he couldn't, because Edward steadfastly refused to let go of his wife.
It's pretty shady behavior, and he made pretty quick work of it.
Yeah. Dr. Knapp determined that Elva had died of an everlasting faint, which was an 1800s way of saying she'd had a heart attack at 23. He later changed the cause of death to complications from pregnancy, although that's also kind of weird since no one, not even Edward, thought she was pregnant. Edward oversaw every single aspect of his young wife's burial preparations, gently placing rolled-up clothing under and around her head so she'd be comfortable. He also insisted on tying her favorite scarf around her neck. Then he had her casket transported to Big Sewell Mountain, back to her mother. During the funeral, Edward was overcome with grief, never straying far from the casket, tearfully explaining to everyone that he wanted Elva buried with her favorite scarf around her neck. But it didn't match her dress at all, and he had tied it over her head, in addition to the veil he had already put over her face. When asked if it could be removed, he insisted that it was her favorite and she would have wanted to wear it. Elva was buried the next day.
Boy, at this point, I'd be pretty suspicious of foul play.
Well, her mom certainly was. She prayed every night for Elva's spirit to come to her, and a month later, Mary Jane began having her visions. At first, like I said, Elva appeared to her as just a ball of light, but over the course of 3 more nights, Elva insisted that her mother should know the truth, that Edward had broken her neck. that he was abusive and cruel to her, and her final moments of life had been filled with his rage over a meatless dinner.
He really liked his meat.
No vegetarian meals for him.
No.
Poor Elva's spirit would not be at rest until the truth was revealed. Mary Jane first went to her brother-in-law, Johnson Heaster, and told him about her visions. Convinced that Elva's ghost was urging her to prove her murder, Mary Jane insisted that they do something. The two of them then went to Lewisburg prosecutor John Preston and told him their suspicions. Whether Preston believed Mary Jane or not, he agreed to take on the case, and what he found was pretty disturbing. First, Edward was really Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue, and he had served time in the penitentiary for stealing a horse. Apparently, while he was in prison, he often boasted that he would be the man with 7 wives. Preston also discovered that Elva was Shue's 3rd wife, and that at least one of his previous wives had had an interesting accident.
So he didn't want 7 wives at one time like a harem. He wanted to accumulate 7 wives.
One right after the other. Yes.
That's sick.
Shue's first wife had divorced him under allegations that he was physically abusive towards her. His second wife, who was only married to him for 8 months, was helping him repair a chimney when the basket of rocks they were lifting suddenly overturned on its pulley and emptied down on her head.
God, this guy had no limits.
Next, Preston went to see Dr. Knapp, who described Shue's odd behavior and admitted that he hadn't really been able to do a full examination of Elva's body. So, that was enough for Elva to be exhumed in order for a complete autopsy to be done. Shue was enraged by this and, quote, vigorously complained to anyone who would listen. But by this point, public sentiment had turned against him. Everyone had heard about Elva's ghost and her plea for the truth. But Shue just ran his mouth and was quoted in the Greenbrier Independent that he knew he would be arrested, but, quote, they will not be able to prove I did it.
Well, I thought he said, she had died of natural causes.
Exactly, which, to me, only a man who knows it was foul play would say something like that.
Right.
Elva's body was brought to the one-room schoolhouse where Dr. Knapp, along with 2 other doctors, performed the autopsy. They found all the evidence they needed that Elva's ghost was telling the truth. The Pocahontas Times reported, quote, on the throat were the marks of fingers indicating that she had been choken, that the neck was dislocated between the first and second vertebrae. The ligaments were torn and ruptured. The windpipe had been crushed at a point in front of the neck.
Now, see, it's a good thing they were able to exhume her, because if she had been cremated, they would have never known, and he would have got off scot-free.
Right. Shue was arrested and tried for Elva's murder. Now, to be clear, there was 0 mention of Elva's ghost in the prosecution's case. 0. Preston relied on the circumstantial evidence of Shue's behavior and his comments and his past record, and he had Andy Clark testify. It was Shue's lawyer who not only brought up Elva's ghost, but badgered Mary Jane about her ghost story. To her credit, Mary Jane stuck to her guns, despite being made to repeat her story over and over and over. But the thing is, her story never changed. Her daughter had appeared to her in visions over the course of 4 nights, showing her that her neck was broken. Despite the defense lawyer insisting that she must have been dreaming, Mary Jane insisted she was not. Court documents state that she testified that her daughter's ghost told her the following. Shue, quote, came that night from the shop and seemed angry. I told him supper was ready, and he began to chide me because I had prepared no meat. I replied, there was plenty. Bread and butter, applesauce, preserves, and other things that made a good supper. He flew into a rage, got up, and came toward me. When I raised up, he seized each side of my head with his hands and by a sudden wrench dislocated my neck.
Can you imagine you pass on to the other side, which is supposed to be peaceful and everything, and you have to relive that moment over and over?
It would be like a form of torture, I think. I mean, how could a spirit rest if they're constantly repeating that in the afterlife?
Yeah, that's sad.
When pressed further by Shue's lawyer, Mary Jane continued that Elva had even described her home to her, which Mary Jane had never even visited. She was able to describe her daughter's home in great detail and where Elva told her to look for blood, and that's where blood was found. Shue's main defense was to insist that everyone was just, quote, out to get him, and demanding the jury to, quote, look into his face and then say if he was guilty. They did, and they found him guilty. After deliberating for just 70 minutes.
Well, that wasn't the thing to say.
No. He was sentenced to life in prison at the West Virginia State Penitentiary, and an angry lynch mob of locals didn't plan on letting him get there, but they were disbanded before they could get their hands on him. He died from an unknown epidemic that swept through the prison in 1900.
Oh, it's kind of too bad they didn't get their hands on him, because I feel like he got off way too easy. Dying in prison? That just makes me sick after all that he committed against others.
Mm-hmm. Well, back to Mary Jane, Elva's mother, and the obvious question, did a ghost really solve her own murder? Some people say, yes, of course she did, that Mary Jane really was visited by her dead child's spirit, and that her spirit would not rest until her murder was solved. But others argue that Mary Jane, who supposedly never liked Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue, simply had her own suspicions and concocted the ghost story in order to be heard. But if that's true, how are her details so accurate? And what if the autopsy had proven that Elva really had died of natural causes? Then she would have been like the laughingstock of the town. So why would she take that risk?
Right.
There are more cynical people out there who wonder if Mary Jane had it out for Shue all along and made up the story to try and frame him for Elva's murder. But how would Mary Jane even know it was a murder? Unless she had something to do with it.
I don't think so.
It's a rather dark thought, and not one that has ever been fully examined, probably because there was never any evidence of that. And Shue's own words and actions certainly didn't make it seem like he thought Mary Jane had anything to do with it. In all of his quoted comments, he never once tried to say that it was Mary Jane who had done anything. So I'm going with the first explanation, that Elva Heaster Shue's ghost visited her mother and really did solve her own murder.
Right. And does it really matter how it came to the conclusion that they found out that it was murder? Because if you look at it this way, if she would have not said anything at all, her daughter would have been buried and he would have gotten away with it.
Or somebody would have.
Right.
Right.
And it's just my personal opinion, but I think her daughter did come to her and tell her what happened.
It's an intriguing case for sure, and I just hope that afterwards Elva was able to rest in peace.
Well, that was very interesting. I've always loved that story, and I learned a little bit something new tonight that I didn't know about it. So I think that about wraps it up for this episode.
Yeah, I think so. And as always, you can check our sources at the bottom of our show notes if you want to know more.
That's right, and if you follow us on Facebook, Beth always posts about what the upcoming episode is going to be about a couple days ahead of time. So if you haven't checked us out on Facebook, check us out at Where Our Minds Wander.
Yeah, I like to post pictures of what we're going to be talking about so people have a visual.
Right.
So I guess we'll see you all again next week on the next episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
See y'all soon.
Thank you for joining us. We look forward to traveling with you again to the places where our minds wander.
If you like what you heard, please take a moment and provide us with a 5-star rating and a comment on your favorite listening platform. It really helps us move up the list and become more visible on the podcast charts so new people can find us.
Thank you all for your continued support.
See you all next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.